Hello everyone, and welcome to another devlog for Bottled Sky, an action exploration game with a big drill. As luck would have it, I got sick again just like last month's video, so if I sound sick, you'll just have to deal with it again. I was hoping to have this one done much sooner, but I guess I'm just going to have to say that this devlog covers both May and June so that I have time to rest and recover, rather than rush to have another video out at the end of this month. Last video, I analysed the state of combat information regarding enemies that are off-screen. The problem I wanted to solve was that I wanted to make sure that nearby enemies that are in combat with you should be on-screen. I used a tool I called the Discoverability Spectrum to understand the availability of information on that topic, and made it clear that in general, enemies in combat with you should remain as close to being as highlighted as possible. I discussed a couple of solutions to help with this problem, but I didn't finish creating the solutions I chose, so this video will be following on from the previous video. Go and check it out if you want some context, but it's not required to understand this video. A lot of you seem to really enjoy this topic and shared your ideas and feedback, so I'll be addressing some of those comments within this video before I talk about the new stuff. And without further ado, let's dive in. Last video, I discussed 3 possible solutions to the problem. One of them was edge markers, which I made and showed off in the last video. These edge markers help to push the known information about an enemy's whereabouts closer towards being highlighted, but I'm still not satisfied with how a nearby enemy can still be off-screen. These help you aim your own projectiles at off-screen enemies, and they tell you exactly what direction a projectile may likely come from, but avoiding them would still be difficult without being able to see the enemy's animations. Another solution I discussed was about adding a minimap to see more of your surroundings. Ultimately, I decided that I would rather not have a minimap as it can take up a significant portion of screen real estate. And there are other pitfalls that I'm worried about falling into, but I did entertain the idea of having an audio source radar for audio accessibility. Fortnite has a pretty good take on this idea. Certain in-game sound effects become represented on this ring around your crosshair, such as footsteps of nearby players or gunfire. Finally, another solution I discussed was to just zoom the camera out so you can see more of what's around you. I changed the game's code a bit to get this footage of what the game would look like if it was always zoomed out. I did talk about why I didn't like this idea, but this comment summarizes pretty well why it's a bad idea. It reduces visual accessibility of individual elements because they are now smaller on your screen, and I've carefully tailored how much zoom I like my game to have at any specific moment. It can also make your game look less appealing. The very second video I made in this devlog series is entirely dedicated to how important camera work is for game feel, and it's something I reference and improve on constantly. Camera zoom and panning is very dynamic in my game, so if I want to change it, it has to be planned carefully and tested thoroughly. Simply zooming out technically solves the problem, which is why I tested it, but it created other problems, so I explained my issues with it and let go of this idea. However, I did also mention in the video that I probably could create a more dynamic solution that doesn't harm the carefully crafted camera experience I've built for the rest of the game. In fact, I've known for a long time that combat was a specific part of the camera experience that I still need to work on. This card on my Trello board was created in August last year. I'll get back to this in more detail later, but first I want to look at some other comments you have sent me. This viewer suggests that I make enemies only shoot after the initial encounter. They also provide some details for behavior alterations while off-screen. This technically works, and I kind of already have this in a partial manner, although I have a reason for why each enemy behaves the way it does and would rather not alter that. I try to not treat enemies as just mindless hostile entities that attack the player on sight, and instead more like wildlife that have their own behaviors even when not in combat. Part of having their own behaviors also includes how they react to the player's shuttle and even other wildlife. I don't want enemies to be able to factor in camera size when they're shooting projectiles, because there are times when the space on screen is quite limited, and it would be quite easy for the player to abuse these camera variables to avoid some combat mechanics. This is an idea that could work perfectly fine for many games, but for Bottled Sky, it may harm the variety that exists and what has been planned for future enemies. This reply suggests making the marker flash when an enemy attacks off-screen. I actually kind of like the idea, but I also agree that it's better to just have the enemy be on screen when it attacks if possible. So just like the edge markers themselves, it's really just a band-aid solution. I might end up using this idea for something else, I'm just not sure what yet. Likely for tutorializing the edge markers and waypoint system. This comment has a few ideas to build on the edge markers and player knowledge. This portion suggests that the amount of information a marker gives can change depending on what we can expect the player knows or doesn't know. Right now, the markers don't show what enemy or destination they're pointing at because it's unfinished, but I can certainly add this functionality even if it just means the player isn't being spoiled a few seconds earlier by the marker. Thanks for the idea. This next line suggests that the marker UI could be upgraded to last longer or work at larger distances. Currently, the plan is for it to point at any NPC that is being aggressive towards the player, regardless of distance, and I don't think I'm going to change that, but I might consider building further functionality that can be unlocked by the player through gameplay. Speaking of further functionality, this last line suggests giving the player some advantage towards enemies that the player has learned more about. Personally, I prefer the philosophy that enemies become easier to fight naturally through knowledge and experience, so I'm probably not going to artificially give buffs like this. For example, after encountering a new enemy, especially if they did not defeat it, an NPC might tell you about their experience fighting that kind of enemy and reveal tips like weaknesses, weak points, exploitable behaviors, and so on. Secondary to that, enemies drop loot which can be used to upgrade or create better items and equipment, which will in its own way give players better attack, defense, special effects, more combat abilities, etc. Thanks for the suggestions. Here's a comment that expresses concerns over adding numerical data to the UI. Something I briefly mentioned in the last video was adding a distance counter to these edge markers. I will be doing everything I can to avoid overcluttering the UI. Especially during combat, I want players to be most focused on the action because I want players to be in a reactive flow mindset rather than a strategic and analytical mindset. I even designed this health and boost UI such that it has no numbers because I only want players to glance at it and get a general idea of how much health or boost they have left. On top of that, I'll have various other visual and audio indicators that trigger at important thresholds. That being said, outside of combat, when the player is not in the heat of the moment, I'm okay with giving the players some more information. Outside of combat, I will be encouraging players to plan out their exploration trips and decide what to bring with them. To make any informed decision, the player has to have some information to work with. This is inspired by games including Monster Hunter and Stardew Valley, where I personally enjoyed some amount of preparation before leaving your home base to achieve your goals. I found a mock-up of these edge markers I made almost a year ago that I'd completely forgotten about. You'll note that I had intentionally given a distance counter to some faraway objective, but the enemy marker has no distance counter. I'm never expecting hostile enemies to be too far off screen, so I don't feel that they need a distance counter or any of the other suggested features. I also feel that none of these suggestions are actually adequate enough to tell the player that their objective is 500 meters away as opposed to 3 kilometers. As a default, I only plan on having 2 of these distance markers on screen at any time. One will show the way back home, and the other points towards your current objective. Beyond that, I can allow the player to add as many markers as they like using a map feature I haven't built yet. All of these have been insightful comments that gave me a lot to think about whether I use these suggestions or not, so keep them coming. And thank you to everyone else who liked, subscribed, and/or left positive comments to boost the video algorithmically. It's actually been a huge success, and the video has surpassed my previous best by an order of magnitude. I appreciate you all. With that out of the way, let's move on to the latest addition to the game, the combat camera. I've already vaguely described it as a combination of panning and zooming to keep nearby enemies on screen, but how will it work? I don't want to get too technical, so there's no code snippets, but I'll make diagrams and describe my thought process while building this feature. My first idea was to take the positions of all combatants, including the shuttle, calculate the average position, and have the camera point at that. In the current state of the game, this works okay because most fights are one-on-one, so the average is exactly halfway between the shuttle and the enemy. However, this was overall a terrible idea because if there are multiple enemies close to each other, then the camera will mostly be focused on them, when I prefer the focus to still be mostly on the shuttle. My second idea was to check all of the positions and sort of create a bounding box that encompasses all hostile enemies and the shuttle. Then calculate the center of that box and point the camera towards that. Now it doesn't matter if there are lots of enemies in one place. This was a better start, but a drawback remains. If the player wants to flee from a fight, then the player is going to be on the edge of the screen, making it very difficult to see where you're going. To combat this, I made sure that the camera is always limited to be within a certain range from the shuttle. If the center of this bounding box is too far away from the shuttle, then the camera is pushed more towards the shuttle. So far, I've only been adjusting the camera's position, and the zoom is set to my chosen closest zoom level. I haven't started working on calculating zoom yet, and this is already looking much better, but I'm not done yet with panning. After doing some testing, I realized that I don't mind if the shuttle is close to the edge of the screen as long as the shuttle is facing towards the center. It's mainly when I'm trying to flee, that's when I don't want the shuttle anywhere near the edge of the screen. In the code, I have the direction the shuttle is facing and the direction from the shuttle to the center of the combat bounding box. With those two directions, I can calculate the dot product, which is a mathematical function that returns the value of 1 if they're pointing in the same direction, or -1 if they're pointing in opposite directions. With that, I will adjust how much the camera is pushed towards the shuttle based on how low this value is. I think this might need some tweaking later, but I believe that it is fundamentally on the right track. Now I want to figure out how much to zoom in or out. The requirements for this are simpler. Firstly, the shuttle must be on screen, and hopefully all of the positioning I've just talked about handles that well enough. Secondly, I don't want to zoom out too far, so I've chosen a limit for how far back the camera can move. If there is an enemy that won't be on screen when zoomed out to the max limit, then it should be ignored from all the panning and zooming calculations if possible. That is when the edge markers from the last video come in handy, as it tells the player that there is an enemy that is still hostile but too far away for it to matter right in the moment. Thirdly, I don't want to zoom in too far either, so a minimum zoom limit must be included too. Here's what I managed to come up with. I couldn't exclude distant enemies based on the calculated center of the combat bounding box, because then I would need to recalculate the entire bounding box, possibly several times in a single frame. Well, I could, but I decided it was more efficient to just use the camera's position from the previous frame and exclude enemies too far from that, hoping that the camera's previous position isn't too far from its new target position. From there, I looped over every nearby enemy and calculated how much the camera would need to be zoomed to have that enemy on screen, and then I used the value that encompasses all of them just right. From there, I looped over every nearby enemy and calculated how much the camera would need to be zoomed to have that enemy on screen, and then I used the largest value to encompass all of them, ignoring any values over my chosen maximum. Reading this script back, I hope these technical details become much easier to understand with the diagrams and editing. Leave a comment if you still have questions and I'll do my best to answer in the replies. Overall, I think I've managed to create the camera motion I was looking for. In the future, I may need to do some tweaking to get the game feel right, or to optimize for new enemy behaviors that get added to the game, but in the present, I think it's unwise to make any more changes without knowing future requirements. Before the next video, I have a backlog of bugs to fix and unfinished features to clean up, along with several IRL events, so as I said in the beginning in the video, this video will be considered as both the May and June devlog to give myself some time to catch up. If you enjoyed this video, then leave a like and subscribe to be notified about future videos. Thanks for watching, that's all for now, and I'll see you later.